My name is Jonathan Zeitlin. I'm a professor at the University of Amsterdam, and I am the academic director of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, ACES, which is sponsoring this series. This is the third in our series of what we're calling virtual visions of Europe on pandemic politics and corona crisis response. The first two installments in our series covered the public health response to the crisis, issues of coordination and non-coordination, as well as the social and economic policy responses to the crisis. And you can find, we recorded these sessions, you can find them on YouTube, you can find also the links on the ACES website, www.aces.uva.nl. Now, one of the things that was extremely evident in our first two sessions is that the public health and economic and social policy responses to the pandemic, these are not just issues of policy and governance, they're very highly political. They have political consequences and they're influenced by politics. And one of the most crucial dimensions, which I think all of our speakers will focus in different ways on, is the interaction between national politics and European politics. And this is very much a question of what our organizer, Theresa Kuhn, calls the boundaries of solidarity. So one of the things that we see is a tension, for example, particularly here in the Netherlands, between national solidarity and European solidarity, that leaders may behave in an exceptionally, unusually solidaristic way vis-a-vis their own populations, but appear to behave in a very nationalist, not to say egoistic way, vis-a-vis citizens of other EU member states. So let me just explain a little bit about the format, and then I will turn, and the speakers, and then I'll turn over to the organizer. So we have four speakers tonight. The organizer and first speaker will be Theresa Kuhn, who is an associate professor of political science here at the UvA, is the author of a prize-winning book on experiencing European integration. Our second speaker will be Sarah de Lange, who is the Den Uyl professor in the political science department and is an authority on populist parties and politics, which is what she will largely talk about. The third speaker is Brian Burgoon, who's a professor of international and comparative political economy here at the UvA. Actually, I've got the order wrong. He's going to be the fourth speaker. You must excuse me. And he works on issues of globalization, welfare, and democracy, which is what he'll speak on. And we're very happy to have as our outside guest, actually a former colleague, Catherine de Vries, who is a professor of political science at Bocconi University in Milan, and is also an advisor to the Upinions platform of the Bertelsmann Foundation, which produces a lot of public opinion research. And she's also the author of a prize-winning book on Euroscepticism and the future of European integration. So once again, Theresa will begin, followed by Sarah, followed by Catherine, and then Brian. They'll each have 5 minutes, then 2 minutes to react to one another. Theresa will have a couple of minutes extra to introduce the session. And then once we've had these mutual responses, we will open up to Q&A. You'll find the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen. You can start typing at any time questions, and then I'll select among them, read them out, and direct them to the appropriate speaker. So Theresa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thanks also a lot to Sarah, Brian, and Katharine for actually joining us today from their respective homes. It's really a pleasure. It's been a pleasure to organize this and to think about the questions that we're going to discuss today. And I'm looking forward to your contributions. In my introductory round, I would like to kind of set out the bigger themes of this panel today, and also how they link to what you're all going to speak about. And I actually want to make basically two big points. So the first one is that, I mean, many people have already remarked that the state is really back. So that's maybe not so new. We see that it's taking on a much bigger role again. It's also back with respect to the EU. The EU has so far been rather in the back, so to speak. But I think not only the state is back, but also the belief in the state is back, or it might be even higher than ever before. So in the first weeks after the lockdown, or in the weeks also leading up to the lockdown, we saw very high levels of endorsements for political leaders across Europe and also beyond Europe, with some notable exceptions such as Bolsonaro. But in general, a lot of European leaders have had a really exceptionally high levels of support from their voters, and also from the people who actually had not voted them before. We also have seen very high approval rates for the lockdowns themselves and for the measures that were taken, and high compliance. And there were actually, the partisan divides were almost muted. So even the opposition parties often had actually a hard time. I mean, this depends, of course, in which country you're in, but for example, in Austria in the first weeks, the opposition parties had a hard time really finding fault at what the governments were actually doing. And I think here an interesting question to ask is if the EU had actually taken a more active role and a more visible role, would it have also been able to have such a high support, both in terms of, support for what they are doing, but then also in terms of compliance with these rules. So in other words, would we listen and take the EU leaders as seriously as we take our national leaders seriously? And the other important question is, of course, how long does this kind of honeymoon phase last, and how long do voters support these kind of strict rules and curtailment in a way of their daily lives? And I think here we already see that as the situation is becoming more and more under control, that people are actually becoming more critical. And I think here I'm coming to my second point, that it's really important to distinguish between different phases. So we've had this kind of honeymoon phase so far, and now we are entering a new phase, not only in terms of the containment of the virus, but also with respect to the politics of it. And while before there was high support for a lot of measurements, and partisan divides were not that clear, now this sense of urgency is dwindling, and now also a discussion starts about who should be the first ones to be allowed to actually scale back their restrictions. So in a way, you see certain new NIMBYs behaviors, also lobbying by different industries, different parts of society, why what they're doing or who they are is more crucial to society and to the survival of the society. And I think here the question is, of course, what are these conflicts and these dividing lines in a way? And I think at the domestic level, a question is who's actually having to take the biggest burden of it. And here the interesting thing is that actually the people who are most at risk in terms of health, elderly, are actually the ones who maybe have the least financial problem with some of the restrictions, because a lot of them already have pensions that are relatively secure, and they might also not have to take care of young children, etc. But since this is a Visions of Europe panel, I would like to talk more about the European dimension in here. And I think here we see two major divides that have existed before, but that have become more pronounced in this crisis. And the first divide is a conflict about democracy, rule of law, and sovereignty. And on the one hand, we see that in some member states, governments such as, for example, in Hungary, have really seized the moment to install sweeping emergency plans that have clear autocratic traits to basically benefit their own interests. And Sarah will talk about much more about this issue, and also about the role of populism across Europe. On the other hand, also with respect to the question of democracy and sovereignty, the decision by the German Constitutional Court last week also epitomizes really another conflict that has been, in the background in the EU for a long time, namely about national sovereignty and where the power really lies. So while this first divide is really about democracy and rule of law, the second one is about transnational solidarity. And here, this is also a conflict that has been looming, or not looming, but has been going on for quite a while. And we see that this conflict relates to the extent to which and the conditions under which the EU and its member states should actually assist other member states in need. And here we have both Katharina talking about this conflict, both from a perspective as an expert of EU politics, but also as a Northern European currently living in the South. And we also have Brian, who will discuss solidarity, talking about a very recent survey. He will also talk about the first question with respect to how democracy will change, or how our understanding changes. So while Brian will also refer to basically the question of solidarity perceived by the public right now, as I argued before, public opinion can be quite volatile in times of crisis. And the question is, whatever we observe right now, how long will that actually last? And I think here it's good to have some kind of baseline, to know what is the baseline of solidarity in Europe in normal times, so to speak. And here my own research comes in. And here we see basically, as Jonathan already has mentioned, that solidarity in the European Union is nationally bounded. Last week, Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, just the former NATO secretary, just had a very interesting piece in NRC where he said, yeah, in times like these, it's sometimes easy to forget that there's anything else beyond your own member state or your own nation state. He was referring to the Netherlands, but I think this can be also generalized to other countries. And this is something that I've seen in my own research on solidarity, that people generally really prefer to help people from their own member state, from their own country. And the interesting thing is that even the people who are most likely to support European solidarity, so the highly educated, those who have a strong sense of European identity, who are generally more cosmopolitan, even those people, if you really give them the option, do you prefer to share resources with yourself, with people from your own country or with other Europeans, then they will go for people from their own country. And I think this is something that is important to keep in mind, because here I think the role of national leaders comes in. So I think there is, and I think Brian will share much more detailed information about that, but there is generally significant support for European solidarity across the European Union. But if national leaders frame it in terms of us versus them, like, okay, you can either help us or the others, then I think a lot of people will actually retreat from some kind of transnational solidarity. So in that respect, I would say that solidarity is bounded nationally, but these bounds are also not, they can be overcome. And I think political leaders play a big role, and also the way in which policies are actually designed. But I think here also Brian will tell you much more about this. I would like to now just end my introduction here and give over the floor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Theresa. I think you've adumbrated a whole series of issues that we will be discussing tonight. And I now turn it over to Sarah De Lange. Sarah, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss populism with you tonight. If we're talking about the politics of the Corona crisis, it's almost inevitable to talk about populism, because of course, prior to the crisis, this was one of the main developments in advanced democratic societies, the fact that populist parties, but especially populist radical right parties, were increasingly gaining ground in the polls, but also in terms of their government participation across a number of countries. After the Corona crisis started, it didn't take long for a whole range of scholarly comments and opinion pieces to emerge that either predicted that this crisis would signify the end of the success of populist movements, or that claimed that the Corona crisis would further fuel the success of these parties and that they would become the main political actors in the years to come. I'll briefly outline the arguments that the two camps have, and as any scholar would probably then do, conclude that the truth is somewhere in the middle, and discuss actually the fact with you that there's a lot more variation between these two extremes that we should be mindful of. So let me first look at the argument that the current crisis might mean the end of populism as we know it, and that it might result in the collapse of populist parties across the globe. Usually in these kinds of analyses, three arguments are presented that in itself are valid, that might play a role in the future success of populist parties, but that, in my opinion, will not affect all populist parties equally. And those arguments are that, first of all, the Corona crisis has shifted the emphasis from representation as a key democratic value to effective governance and effective use of state capacity as a democratic value. So at the moment, because we're in a situation of crisis, we're less concerned with whether or not groups of citizens are properly represented in politics, and more concerned with the quality of our policy outcomes, because we want to tackle this crisis. The second is that the Corona crisis has led to a reappreciation of expertise, something that populist parties, of course, criticized for a long time. And the third argument for the decline of populism, and probably the most influential one, is that the current Corona crisis has pushed sociocultural issues evolving around immigration, integration, and identity to the background, and that it has been these issues from which populist radical right parties have profited electorally, And that they will face a challenge now that our politics will be again more about socioeconomic issues. Because on socioeconomic issues, these parties have rather blurred positions, and they also lack issue ownership on these issues. So they're not necessarily seen by voters as particularly credible when it comes to their competences in matters of socioeconomic legislation. So these are the three arguments as to why the crisis would signify the end of populism. The arguments for a rise of populism after the Corona crisis are slightly different. The arguments are first of all that the current crisis has led to a lack of conflict in politics. So we've seen that there have been widespread appeals to national unity in politics, and this has led to cooperation between opposition forces and government forces in many countries, with opposition parties declaring that they will not press governments too much on their policy making. We've also, of course, seen that parliamentary debate as a whole has been restricted by the constraints that Corona has imposed on daily practices in our parliaments. And this all has led to a relative degree of polarization. And it could be that populist parties profit from that because it reinforces their claim that there is collusion amongst political elites and that political conflict is not prominent enough in politics. I think a second reason why populism is set to be gaining from this crisis is that it might lead to further politicization of EU integration processes. So it will put new emphasis on issues of border control, on issues of EU solidarity, as well as on issues of austerity. And these are, of course, issues that populist parties, populist radical right parties have been quite familiar with and have campaigned on in the past years. So potentially they could profit from this. As I already said at the start of my talk, I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. There's a number of factors that could help populist parties, and there's a number of factors that might help them hold them back. And this is also what we're currently seeing in the polls. We're seeing that some populist parties, populist radical right parties, are profiting from the crisis, are making small gains, while others are experiencing small losses. And I think the most important thing to stress with respect to the polls is that gains and losses at the moment are relatively small. So what we're seeing is that despite the fact that every country across Europe is experiencing a rally around the flag effect, so a situation in which national leaders gain support from citizens simply by the fact that we're experiencing an imminent crisis that is both external in nature and existential in nature. And we know that under these conditions, national leaders almost always profit. We see that despite these conditions, populist radical right parties are actually making small gains and small losses. So they're not hugely affected by this. In fact, if we look at the gains and losses, they're somewhere between -4 and +4 percent points. Now, for parties that are polling often somewhere between 15 and 25% in the polls, this is actually not a major shift in their electoral positioning. In fact, in most countries, it means that they're moving from being first or second in the polls to being second or third. So it's not a major upset of the balance of power between rivaling political parties. So what is then happening with populist radical right parties across Europe? I think we're seeing three different developments. The first one is that populist radical right parties in opposition that have no desire to govern are really campaigning against current governments and blaming them either for lockdowns or for not locking down, depending on what their government policies are. We also see a group of populist radical right parties in opposition that are keen to show that they're salonfähig, that they are able to take responsibility. And we see this especially in the Scandinavian countries. And there, the government, the populist radical right parties are actually being quite cooperative, behaving like other opposition parties in this crisis. And then, of course, there's a third group of parties that are currently in office, especially in Central Eastern Europe, Hungary, Poland, where they're using this crisis as a context to further the transition of the regime from a democratic one to a more authoritarian one. And I think the last thing is something that we'll discuss more extensively throughout this meeting.
Thank you, Sarah. This raises a question which maybe we can come back to, which is whether there's a difference between populists in Europe and outside Europe, since Donald Trump and Bolsonaro might be very happy to be in the situation that you just described. So now I'm going to hand over to Catherine de Vries.
Well, first, thank you so much to Jonathan and Theresa for the invitation, and for ACES and everybody around in the team for organizing this so smoothly. So I'm going to talk more about the European perspective. So we're and maybe coming back to one of, one of these two dimensions of contestation that Theresa was talking about. So I think the coronavirus outbreak is kind of the latest stress test for the EU, right? So we seem to have forgotten Brexit, but Brexit was one of the things that we were talking about a lot last year and the years before, disagreements over the refugee crisis, and before that, the Eurozone debt crisis. So we've seen quite considerable contestation over the EU in the past decade or so. So now what we're seeing in the coronavirus response is that Europeans face disagreements about how to coordinate joint action to deal with the economic fallout, and especially disagreements about whether to issue joint debt as a response to the economic hardship, or to do this via loans, or even perhaps, if we sometimes hear the Dutch government, do nothing at all. So the case in point actually is that conflict between, in the first Eurogroup meeting, between the Dutch government represented by Hoekstra and Gentiloni, who was the finance minister of Italy. And for me, that's been particularly interesting because I'm a Dutch person living in Italy. So having some other meetings here with diplomats, it was a bit of a crisis within the crisis, as one diplomat formulated it. So what you see is that political leaders have a hard time, right? And they have a hard time because of the reasons that were outlined before, that actually the way we deal with Europe has become part and parcel of domestic politics. So they face strong oppositions for kind of European policy solutions, but for different reasons. So Northern and Southern Europeans have sharply different views about how to deal with the problem in Europe. And I will Sarah talked about the East and the West. We can also spend an entire time about that, but I'll focus more on that North-South divide. So what I wanted to do in the rest of the presentation, or my contribution, is to really talk a little bit about how do we get here? So how do we get in this dilemma, this North-South divide? And then maybe also what's at play now. So what are perhaps also, maybe in the Q&A, we can talk about solutions. I don't have a crystal ball, but at least to maybe talk a little bit about the discussions that are going on right now. So let me kind of talk first about how did we get here. And I think the crucial element is that all these previous kind of crises or stress tests have really shaped public opinion. So what we did now in this crisis is start basically within a couple of meetings. In Dutch you would say, de vlam is in de pan geslagen. So basically, the house was on fire straight away. And that's because there was so much politicization about the EU already from previous crises. So this is basically a legacy of old fights about how Europe should have handled in the Eurozone debt crisis, and maybe in the aftermath. And I think in Italy also very important that Italy felt already a bounded level of solidarity, to use Theresa's terms, when it came to the refugee crisis, i.e. that they had themselves had to negotiate, that moment in time, Prime Minister Renzi had to negotiate a deal with the Libyan government because the EU was not necessarily willing to do its part. If that's true or not, but that's the way it's perceived. So my own research really shows that these previous crises had already churned Euroscepticism from a minority phenomenon into something that we see in larger parts of the population, irrespective of being kind of, supporting extreme or populist parties or being in kind of bad weather economic conditions. Doesn't mean that everyone who wants to leave the European Union, we can talk about that. That's not the type of Euroscepticism that I'm talking about, not kind of British Euroscepticism, but the idea that certain things, certain policies or certain institutions are not operating perfectly. So these EU member states have now become increasingly interconnected, but fundamentally disagree about how to share the economic burden and how to regain competitiveness. Where the South, as I said, wants to see some form of joint debt instrument, the North is very unwilling to do that. And the reason why we see that these national politicians are articulating very different levels of critique towards the EU is because people's experiences and member states' experiences with the EU have diverged so tremendously in the last decade of European integration, where we see Northern European countries being able to regain competitiveness fairly quickly. So they have now what's called fiscal space, so money to spend, if you will, to prop up companies, to help and to provide aid. This is much less the case in countries like Spain and Italy that were actually, in this case, the hardest hit. And I think what particularly has been problematic for the South to digest is that they perceive the pandemic as being a symmetric crisis. So it's not a crisis, and I'll end on this, that revealed a lot of information about the Southern economies. And it was kind of known that Italy had a debt. It was kind of known that there was a budget deficit in Spain. However, this crisis is affecting everyone in a symmetric way, i.e. everyone is affected by this crisis, but the degree to deal with and to provide the fiscal space in order to fund recovery is very different. I think one last point I want to make, and that has been very much articulated by the French President Macron, there's maybe a particular element that makes this crisis really difficult, because what the EU decided to do is to get rid of state aid laws. So state aid laws was there in order to create fair competition on the single market, right? So that a company in Italy had a very similar level playing field in Germany. But because of the differences now in fiscal space, and companies can now be just helped by the state, we can have a situation in which a very efficient company in Spain and Italy cannot get bailed out, but a less efficient company in Germany or in the Netherlands can. And in that way, not necessarily your business model, but just your location is providing the ability that you can kind of operate and gain from the single market. And I think that's also what makes this particular crisis really difficult, and why there's so much worry in the South about how recovery, or how unequal recovery would look in the future. Thanks very much.
Very interesting point, Catherine. One of the things that's striking is how much the state aid issue is becoming salient, whereas similar relaxation of state aid rules during the Euro crisis, or rather during the financial crisis, didn't have the same effect. But maybe that was because the polarization between North and South had not yet occurred. Okay, our last speaker, Brian Burgoon, will pick up from there. Brian.
Thank you. I also want to thank the organizers for inviting me and for sharing the platform with such a smart bunch of colleagues. I want to start by pointing out something that is a little bit normatively laden, and at least my big point that I think we should all be worried about and thinking about, which is that the crisis that we're facing now has deepened fundamental discussions that are taking place throughout the West about the character of what I would call the Western liberal project. The idea that is shared by certainly industrialized advanced democracies, that liberal democracy is to be embraced and maintained. The idea that there should be some interconnectedness and multilateral engagement and openness politically and economically to one another. And thirdly, and close to my own heart, the idea that in the organizing of economic life, that markets should be managed, markets should be embraced but managed. There are big differences between Western countries in the way they embrace or manifest this project. But what's going on in the context of the COVID crisis is a fundamental rethink, I think, a reshuffling of what is possible with respect to sort of all these basic components of what it means to be a Western democracy. And I want to say that the news, in some ways, is deeply complicated and difficult to predict. But when it comes to the management of capitalism side of things, it's really quite clear that the movement is very much in the direction that Theresa, I think both Theresa and Katharina and I think even Sarah mentioned, moving in the direction of more state engagement. The state is back, right, in the wording that Theresa chose, that there's more salience of the socioeconomic issues in the way that Sarah talked about it. And of course, the fundamental character of the European project is being talked about in terms of the socioeconomic issues. So when it comes to this Western rethink, I actually think that there's going to be, a very substantial increase, certainly the possibility of an increase in a more sort of social Europe. But the lefties might think that's a good thing and really good news. But for me, I'm deeply skeptical about whether the kind of social Europe that we end up with is the kind of thing that I would want, since I care a lot about the liberal side of the European project. I care about engagement, and we should care about engagement. I care about the European project as a manifestation of that engagement. I care about democracy and liberalism, right? And it's not clear that the social project, the state coming back in, is going to be good news from the point of view of the broader idea of the Western project. Fundamental to what is happening in any event is what's happening with solidarity. And I want to spend the rest of my couple of minutes, telling you something about how I think the solidarity dimension or the solidarity side of the story is playing out in the context of the Corona crisis. And the fundamental point to make is that in ways that have been echoed by my colleagues, a lot of different public opinion data that we have that allows us to track what has happened in the sort of pre to current COVID-19 era suggests to us that various measures of solidarity, support for social policies that are manifesting solidarity. These polls are showing that there are quite substantial increases in the embrace of a more social Europe. You see it, for instance, in very broad measures of altruism and solidarity. Indeed, the increases are substantial also for national level solidarity. So worrying about the well-being of people in your own nation state have gone up by about 5% in 3 different polls that you can look at in the last year. But it's important to note that support for or worrying about the well-being of Europeans sort of outside your own country has gone up slightly more than with the concern about the well-being in your own country, right? This is true at least in the 6 countries that to which I have been focusing in data projects with Theresa, among others. And we see also a situation where the levels of solidarity in this very broadest sense are quite substantial. It's not raising explicitly the question about pitting your solidarity towards the fellow Europeans versus solidarity of your fellow citizens. But in general, we're seeing very substantial increases, I think, in a relatively short period of time. Increases that might indeed evaporate as things get more difficult, as the price of solidarity becomes more apparent. But nonetheless, this is a really important set of developments for part of the Western project, the part particularly about managed capitalism. And indeed, if you look at the data on support for public policies that manifest solidarity, so support for government redistribution, support for unemployment insurance, support for European level unemployment insurance, right? Various kinds of projects, such as projects that are being introduced as part of the bailout package, right? The SURE program, for example. If you look at attitudes towards those kinds of programs, you see substantial levels of support. And there's actually been, with respect to the national level policies that you can track over time, that support has been increasing, not too surprisingly, but has been increasing and increasing substantially. And the thing that I want to point out about the attitudes about the social policy is the fundamental uncertainty about what this really means, right? So it's interesting and good news for people who care about this aspect of social provision that Europeans seem to embrace this kind of protection and are solidaristic in various ways, but whether they will really support a European level strengthening of a European social policy project, a social pillar, is unclear, partly because they're just as committed to the national level provisions and strengthening. And if you look closely at the data, you see indeed that the differences between social democrats and liberals and radical left and radical right voters and parties are huge on these issues. And it means that we have uncertainty about what is really going to happen, right? If the radical right has their way, together with, for instance, liberal parties, then you can imagine that the social policy changes are fundamentally a national project and not necessarily something that helps, might in fact hinder the development of the European project. In short, we have a situation where when you just even look at the solidarity dimension, we see very substantial changes and an embrace of, in a sense, the Western liberal project and in the direction of a more activist and managed kind of capitalism, a sort of more embedding of capitalism in society. And the lefties might find that good news. But if you look at the uncertainty about how that will manifest itself, knowing that it can be a chauvinistic version of such social democracy, we should be careful to think that this is really good news. So it's really a fundamentally uncertain time in my judgment. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Brian. I mean, one thing I hear, if I link what you've just said back to what Theresa said towards the end of her talk, is that leadership is crucial, that there are opportunities in the attitudes in public opinion towards wider transnational solidarity, but whether these are realized will depend on how especially national political leaders handle it, mobilize, respond to it. Okay, what I would like to do now, everybody has run on a bit, I think, because there's so much to say about these issues. So I'll give each person 1 minute to respond. So please take just 1 point, maybe even, dare I say, a soundbite that you want to offer our listeners in response to the others. And Theresa, I'll start with you.
And thank you very much, Jonathan, and thanks to the others for these super interesting contributions. I would like to actually just follow up on what just was said by Jonathan, that leadership is crucial. And here, an observation that I've made is that we've seen a lot of, strong leadership at the national level. Across Europe, governments have really implemented, very groundbreaking restrictions of people's daily lives that have huge impact economically on unemployment, etc. So, and there are some countries where maybe a bit more hesitant than others. For example, the Netherlands, it took a bit longer until the lockdown was installed, and it's also not as drastic as, for example, in Spain, but nonetheless, this happened. And then on the other hand, there's very little leadership when it comes to European coordination or solidarity. And here, leaders seem to be much more wary of public opinion, of populist backlash against, for example, co-signing Eurobonds. And I'm wondering to what extent this is only being afraid of the public, or to what extent they like themselves better as the strong national leaders that tell everybody how things should be gone than to actually delegate this power to a European level or to coordinate much more with other people. So that's just a general question I have, and I give the floor over to the next speaker. Thanks.
Thank you, Theresa. Let me just say to the audience that you can put your questions in the Q&A window. Some of you have already used the chat, but please use the Q&A window, and then I will give you the floor soon enough. So Sarah, maybe you can just take a minute to make one point in relation to the discussion so far.
Yeah, just from the perspective of political competition, I think there's a really interesting potential emerging here from this discussion. So we've talked about socioeconomic issues becoming more salient. We've talked about the fact that the state is coming back in and that there is an increase in solidarity among citizens. And for me, that really leaves me wondering whether this will lead to a revitalization of social democracy, or that we will see that this will enhance the prospects of social populist parties, as we've seen, of course, in the financial economic crisis. And I immediately see one of my co-panelists responding to that non-verbally, so I would be very interested to hear what the other panelists have to say.
No, I think that's a great question. Sorry, Jonathan, I'll just respond because then we save time. So I think that's a great question also on the leadership and both of you. And I kind of responded, sorry, I couldn't help myself to the social democracy. So I think what's really important to understand is that to deal with, there is this short-term health crisis that increases a rally around the flag effect, and that governments are not being criticized also by opposition, and for the reasons that Sarah outlined, also because they're not even sitting sometimes, right, in parliament. Think about Britain, for example. And then there's the long-term economic crisis. So in the long-term economic crisis, it will depend on what that crisis will look like. We know that a financial crisis, generates differently. The prediction historically is it goes to the far right. That's actually where we see the biggest. And I think another element which is really important, why I don't think it's going to go that way, and that has to do with Brian's comment about the liberals or conservative liberals and some of the extreme right, is that what we know from work of Margaret Tavitz and others, when the constituency for redistribution increases, government parties on the right have an incentive to move competition away from redistribution because they're not planning to give you much redistribution, and they're going to put it up to the second dimension. And then in Europe, I think that partly what the Dutch government is doing is creating an us versus them, because it basically makes people focus on that rather than on, we can't pay your wages, we can do other things. So there's a strategic dynamic in order for the next election or etc. to do that. So I'm if you really have to put a gun to my face, I am really pessimistic about that kind of I think you're going to see some chauvinist redistribution, if at all redistribution, in the way that Brian, but I might be wrong.
So I thought already in some of the previous exchanges, we have to remember that the 1930s were a period of the return of the state and the expansion of social provision, and famously in at least two different forms, social democratic and national undemocratic, shall we say. Brian, I'll give you the last word in this exchange.
Well, yeah, I don't have, I think this is really uncertain. And I ended by saying that how it's going to manifest itself is unclear. And you guys just, I think, more eloquently described what that uncertainty is. So I think that both of the possibilities that are being mentioned are real ones. So you could imagine the radical right sort of awakening and trying to take ownership of more socioeconomic issues. There have been hints that they can move in that direction in various ways, right? So the history of the PVV, the Freedom Party and the Geert Wilders Party in the Netherlands is a story of a party that experiments with these kinds of more socioeconomic issue position taking. And I could certainly imagine that there's room for that kind of populism, a social populism indeed, as part of taking ownership on the socioeconomic dimension, right? So if we're using the language that Katharina was referring to, there's the left-right dimension in terms of economic intervention by the state. And then there's this more sociocultural and also international engagement, cosmopolitan dimension. And Katharina, citing other people's work and her own work, actually has shown that indeed you see parties that find themselves losing out, partly because salience of the other dimension that they're not gaining ownership on, salience is going up. They have an incentive to do all kinds of things, cue their voters to reawaken the other dimension. Indeed, that's what could happen. So you can have very strong party cueing by the right wing that immigration is the major problem, China and Trump are the major problems, and this could awaken a kind of nationalism that in a sense will take some of the wind out of the sails of the social democratic kind of project, or at least make it a more nationalist, chauvinistic version of that project. So I think that all these things are likely to happen, and that's why it's a political fight. It really does depend on what happens in the coming elections and what happens economically with the sitting governments. Are we going to see this more sort of Western liberal democratic, social democratic awakening, the state coming back in that way, or something uglier? It's not clear.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, now I want to go to the audience, and so far I have 3 questions that have been submitted. So the first one is from our colleague Rob Hachendijk, who asks, what explains the increased support for national and transnational solidarity? Did you look at motives respondents gave and background factors and changes over time during the crisis? And so that's directed to all panelists, but maybe I'm going to direct it first to Theresa and then to Brian. And if others want to come in, you can signal me. So Theresa.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's a very interesting question. And I think there are several reasons for it, or 2 main reasons. One reason is that generally in times of these kind of emergencies, there is this almost spontaneous rise in solidarity. So we've seen similar phenomena, for example, with the refugee crisis in 2015, where in the beginning, a lot of people showed actually a lot of support to helping refugees and to actually letting them in. I mean, you saw in some German and Austrian train stations, people really clapping and supporting the people who were just arriving at these train stations. So I think in these kind of, emergency situations, a lot of people have this very, emotional urge to help others. On the other hand, I think why we could see it here in this particular crisis more than maybe in others is because I think it is a crisis that very much also triggers us to be less individualistic and to think more in our daily lives also about negative externalities of our behavior. So, we're very much being told that, okay, if you now disregard the rules, other people might actually become ill, other people might not be able to go to their office or something like that. So also the sentence by Rutte, only with 17 million Dutch people we can achieve this, maybe frames it very much as something that we can only do together. And I think therefore this of course is very much related to solidarity. This is also something where I think replying to Sarah, I think where the social democracy comes back in this kind of way. But I think these 2 are the main reasons why you could see increases of solidarity at the beginning of a crisis, and then I think the question is how long does it actually last? And I think here this distinction that Katharina also pointed out too between the health crisis and then the really long-lasting economic crisis will be really, really crucial.
Okay, thank you. Brian, I'll give you a chance now
I don't want to
answer quickly.
Theresa said everything that I can think of. That's great. So let's move on.
Sorry?
We can go ahead and move on since that was I don't have anything to add. I haven't studied specifically what is behind the trends that I was tracing really in the last 2 years in the data that I was looking at. But all the arguments that Theresa just articulated strike me as plausible and appropriate for the explanation. So it's the kind of thing we want to look into. So I'm glad you're asking this, Rob.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, I have a question now from someone called Yazid, who asks, the dispute over the Corona bonds between North and South, especially the Netherlands, shows the solidarity between the 2 spheres is fading and could lead to more schisms. He asks, so where does solidarity stand in all of this? And how will Eurosceptics take advantage of this disparity that will affect the South, as Catherine has pointed out? And I take that to be a question for Catherine, but maybe also Sarah wants to add something to it in light of populist strategies.
So just for full disclosure, both in the FT and in the Dutch Financial Times or the Financieel Dagblad, I have a proponent myself for Corona bonds, not sharing legacy debt, but sharing future debt. So just to make sure what my own position is. But I think that the interesting thing is that the reason that I try to outline, just to give you a little bit, I will say something about the Dutch way, is that the Dutch, who have usually saw themselves as merchants within a big space, right? You can think about the way that someone like Thierry Baudet is now using ships and, you know, all these kind of old legacy, however controversial it is. But the interesting thing now, it's very much about being right. So everyone starts about structural reforms straight away, right? That was also the issue with Hoekstra. But the interesting element is if Southern economies can't develop further, or if there's a north-south disparity in recovery, that will hit Dutch firms, especially an economy that is 75% trading to the south. For example, the Dutch flour industry is heavily French, German, Italian. That is their big kind of competitive advantage. So actually, it's self-enlightened. You know, Christine Lagarde called it self-enlightened self-interest, right? It is really something that will help the recovery in the Netherlands. But that's not at all what you hear. And the last thing I want to say about that, I find it very interesting that the Dutch narrative is exactly the narrative how it was in 2010. It's exactly the Southern, you know, Kate McNamara and others have called this the Southern sinners and the Northern saints, right? This idea. But in Germany, you see a much more distinguished discussion. So you see the Spiegel is actually also supporting Corona bonds. Even the Bild-Zeitung did something along that. So it's much more of a diversified discussion. And I think that is where leadership comes in, where you see the president, Steinmeier, but you also see people like Röttgen, who is the chairperson perhaps, or in the race for that of the CDU, also highlighting the responsibility of Germany. And you see very different leadership than what someone was referring to, that in the kind of Dutch debate, it's very much about, we're going to give them money. But that's not what it is about. It's about going to the financial markets and getting shared bonds in order for the South to borrow at a cheaper rate. It's not sharing the current, you know, debt of Italy, right? So there's a lot of discussions that in the Netherlands are all put together and are not really discussed. So I don't think actually it's really only about solidarity. It's very much about the fact that in the Dutch discussion, this idea of interest outside of your own country is just not really coming to the fore in the political discussions.
I mean, it's very interesting, however, that at least much more than in the Euro crisis, there is also a substantial domestic criticism of that position. The center-left parties, D66, the Labour Party, and Green Left have all been very critical of that. And I think that, I mean, that's perhaps a sign of hope. But let me give Sarah a chance to come in on that question, and then we have two more, well, maybe even a few more that we want to take. Go ahead.
Yeah, I completely underline Catherine's analysis. So from an economic logic perspective, the current question of solidarity is a different one than in the financial economic question, right? There's different logics at play. And this is reflected by the fact that in various member states, mainstream parties have slightly different positions as before, as you pointed out, Jonathan. But for populist radical right parties, this doesn't really make a difference, right? Their narrative about the solidarity issue is by and large identical to the one during the financial economic crisis. And it's largely based on stereotypes about Southern economic productivity and public money spending. So I think that for them, very little has changed because they don't take the nuances of the current situation into consideration in their discourse.
Okay, So I have two more questions I'm going to take, and then we'll wind up. One is directed specifically towards Brian from Lena Montmuller, who asks, what could a national alternative be to more social Europe? Isn't the national fragmentation of social and health systems part of the problem? So over to you, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. The answer is that there is, a whole scale of initiatives that have been evolving with respect to social policy. So the social democratic project is fundamentally about the state engaging in various kinds of safety net measures, various ways of regulating labor markets, regulating economic life in a way that is supposed to provide a social minimum or take some labor market risk out of the system. And a great many of those initiatives are really focusing on national beneficiaries and trying to exclude people who come from the outside. So there's like an othering process that takes place, and in particular, a chauvinistic process that takes place where policies get reformed in the direction of sort of increasing the benefits and the access to benefits provided for citizens, natives, and in a sense diminishing or even getting rid of and closing off benefits to outsiders. And I think it's very plausible that in the context of the reform of social policy, the increase in a variety of programs that are part of the aid packages that you see in a lot of countries at the national level, that would create a lot of room for this kind of chauvinist project. And of course, to the extent that ends up costing a lot and taking a big chunk out of GDP, there's going to be less political will and less economic space and traction to do more to help people outside your country. So in the Dutch context, if you're doing a lot to actually improve healthcare and that becomes hell expensive, you're not going to be ready to push for these major transfers to the Spaniards and the Italians, however horrible COVID was for them, and however much you care about solidarity as an ethereal concept, you're not going to want to spend so much money. So I mean, I see that as a completely plausible way of pursuing things politically.
Thanks, Brian. So we have one last question, which I think I'll direct to everyone in the panel who wants to respond. And one of the nice things about this kind of virtual online seminars that people can participate from all over the world. And so this is a question from Willem Maas, who is a professor at York University in Canada and has been lurking in our past two webinars. So Willem, who is a scholar of migration and immigration policy, asks, immigration, including intra-EU free movement, was a significant factor in the Brexit debate and has been a key theme for populist parties for the past quarter century or longer. What do the panelists think about the future politics of immigration and free movement? Maybe I give the floor first to Catherine if she wants to say something about that.
Sure, and I think Sarah will also be able to say quite a lot about that. I think maybe, and Sarah can correct me when I'm wrong, but it is an interesting element, right? So political entrepreneurs are really crucial in keeping these issues salient, right? So you saw it in the EU when it comes to Brexit. So like the average British person didn't think that the EU was the most important thing in their lives, but of course they were also partly made to think that. You can think very similarly of when Salvini was still the leader of Lega, or the still leader of Lega. We'll see if that evolves, but was the interior minister here in Italy, and he was talking about the boats all the time. And there's still boats, right? Or there were until recently still boats, and it was less of a case because he was no longer in government. So what we'll really have to see is the degree to which this crisis, the economic crisis, will overstem that. Historically, and I think it was Jonathan that referred to that, we know that you can get a situation, especially when we would see inflation rise. So when we would see, if perhaps there's an issue on property, on homes. So when people, quote unquote, really would become poorer when it comes to both their pensions, their houses, and in terms of their prices, that you could see then there's scapegoating, right? So I think now a lot of that scapegoating is remember the little clip that you saw with Rutte, don't give the money to the Italians and the Spaniards, right? So that scapegoating is very much within the EU, but it will be the question how that will develop in the future. But I do think that if and Sarah outlined several scenarios, we don't know which one will be the most plausible, but if populist parties are not part and partial of being able to frame the message, right, you do need an entrepreneur to keep this issue really salient. And you see that also in the developments of salience when you look at public opinion. But Sarah is more the expert.
And indeed, Sarah, we'd love to hear your quick thoughts on this topic.
Yes, I think in the short run, borders, border control and free movement within the EU will become even more politicized than they were in the past. So we've, of course, seen that this issue has become greatly politicized during the refugee crisis. But in the context of this crisis, it's also highly relevant. First of all, because many populist radical right parties at the outset of the crisis argued that border controls could have prevented the spread of the virus from Italy to other parts of Europe. Secondly, because we're currently seeing that although free movement of citizens officially exists, national states within the EU really try to control movement across borders, even though they can't. So I'm really sorry. This is sort of what happens if you have a Zoom webinar. So for example, in the Netherlands, even though Germans can freely move across the Dutch border, the police does try to discourage such movements. And part of the reason why the Netherlands closed its cafes and restaurants quite early was also because it was experiencing a large influx of Belgian citizens coming to dine and drink in the Netherlands after their lockdown had been enforced. And we also see now with the relaxation of the lockdown measures that this will also go unevenly across different member states, and that this will lead to negotiations about borders and borders control. We already saw this, of course, in the special case of the UK a couple of days ago, where the UK government announced that anyone traveling from abroad would have to stay in quarantine for 2 weeks. And only hours later retracted that statement for French citizens because Macron had made negotiations about their specific access to the UK. So I think in the short run, as long as we're still in the crisis and still experiencing outbreaks that will also probably become more localized within specific member states, that borders will remain highly politicized. After that, it really depends on what Catherine said, on the extent to which politics will be about socioeconomic or sociocultural issues, and the extent to which radical right-wing populist parties can still act as political entrepreneurs.
Can I just add something to
Sure.
this point? I think something that is also important here is actually the role of the essential workers. And here we actually notice that a lot of essential workers are actually intra-European migrants, especially from Eastern Europe, who always were a bit the second-class citizens, initially not allowed to enjoy free movement, but now actually it's the opposite. So there are airplanes and trains, especially for workers from Romania, Bulgaria, etc., who come to countries such as Germany to actually pick fruit and keep basically our supply chain going. And we see similar developments with respect to care for the elderly. So in Austria, for example, a lot of people rely on 24-hour care services, which is basically run by countries such as Slovakia, Romania, and other Eastern European countries. And even though just a couple of months ago, there was a lot of controversy whether they should all receive the Austrian benefits, and some benefits were actually curtailed now. they're very much welcomed back to Austria and made sure that they actually can all arrive. So I think this adds something very new to this whole process. And I think also the restrictions might have this element that people become more aware of something that they enjoyed very much, namely free movement. And that if you take that away, that might actually also spread support for free movement again.
Thank you. I want to give the last word to Brian, who is also an immigration scholar. Brian, is there anything you want to add to this discussion before we wind up?
The only thing I will add is that the free movement is partly a story about economic integration and trade and the single market as a trade animal, so to speak. And to the extent that we actually see a dismantling of relatively dispersed production chains, that will also create a disincentive for some of the free movement that we've seen, for the actual immigration within the EU that we've seen. So the truth is, it depends a lot on how the trade story evolves, and that's something that's difficult to predict right now. But that's really on top of all the issues, the more political issues that my colleagues just rightly emphasized. I have nothing else to add.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Brian. So in today's discussion, but also in the previous two roundtables in our virtual visions of Europe, we've taken a pretty internal European point of view. We've looked at what's going on within Europe, tensions between member states and also with the European institutions. But of course, there's also an external dimension. There's a geopolitical dimension. This crisis raises big issues about how the European Union relates to its neighbors, to Russia, to the United States, to China. And that will be the subject of our next virtual Visions of Europe roundtable, which will be moderated by ACES co-director Luisa Bialashevich. And we'll wind up with our last episode on the 27th of May, where we'll look at what the implications are for the European Union and for European integration. Those will also be at 8 p.m. live on Wednesdays. And of course, each one you can watch on YouTube. They should be available on YouTube about 24 hours later. So let me just wind up by thanking the panelists for this great discussion. Thanks particularly to Theresa for organizing it. And once again, we hope to see you all here, as they used to say, same time, same channel. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.